everyone. I'm so excited to have you guys all on. This is a discussion that came up like 2 months ago with Hope Rose Kelly and myself. And then I was like, wait, I know somebody who can talk about it. So I emailed my friend Angela, who's here with me, who is the Director of Operations at Orchestra St. Luke's in New York City. And she agreed to come on and talk to us about orchestras. What I love about Angela is that she has a stage management background. So she's going to be able to talk to us about like how that worked with what she's able to do now, and hopefully give everybody a sense of like, you know, if you're a stage manager, you don't have to just stage manage theater. You know, there's all these other options out there. So I'm going to turn it over to Angela. Hopefully you guys can all see my PowerPoint. There you go. I'm going to turn it over to Angela and just have you give a little background about yourself, how you got into this, and then what is it that you do at Orchestra St. Luke's?
Hey, hi everyone. So I actually, as Cynthia was saying, started on a stage management track. That was like my intention out into the world. And I was just sort of like at the level of being like the PA for the roundabout, you know, and I started to get classical music work that I had no idea what I was doing. I happened to know somebody who knew somebody who was bringing me in as sort of like a stage manager type to smaller classical music organizations. And at the same time, the orchestra I work for now was hiring me to stage manage their education concerts, and they happened to need a production manager. And so I sort of fell into classical music being like this rare person on the entire staff who did not have a music background, but I was using a lot of the stage management techniques and all the stuff that I knew from that, and sort of just using that with the orchestra. And so I started as production manager for them, and I'm now senior director of operations, and I've been with St. Luke's for about 15 years. So all that said, what do I do? A lot of what you all do, just under the umbrella of running concerts and running services is what we would call them. So any rehearsal, any concert that pertains to the Orchestra of St. Luke's, wherever the musicians are, I am, and all this done according to union rules. And then there's even administrative things that are associated, again, same as stage managers. We have a little bit of payroll stuff that we also have to do, which is unique there. But yeah, running services, I guess.
I forgot to mention to everyone on this meeting, there's a little section on the bottom that says chat. So if you have any questions, feel free to type them in there, and I'll be helping to moderate. So as we go along, I'll be able to ask those questions and get answers for you. I always forget to mention that at the beginning. I get so excited about introducing the people. Oops. Okay, so to get started, I guess my first question that we had for you was, oh, there's so many questions that we had that were so good. What are ways that you care for instrumentalists that is different than how you would care for a singer or an actor?
Right, so I feel two big differences. One is temperature is always a big thing for us, and I know that's true in the dance world as well. But from regards of tuning instruments and keeping them in tune, we're always very much aware of humidity and temperature, and when are particular instruments being tuned, and how that's affecting them. So that's one thing that I guess is more specific. Another is, especially in my group, and this really depends on the orchestra and who owns the instruments. I can't just pick up a cello. So I need the musician themselves to pick something up or to move something if it was in the way. So it creates this dynamic of your hands are tied sometimes. If you don't communicate in a way that they put their instruments where you want them to be, or if something comes up last minute, that poses a very specific issue. If you were to need something moved, it's not something that even me being there for 15 years, I still can't go touch somebody's instrument. A lot of the time, especially with the string players, the instruments are essentially irreplaceable because they were made in a year very far away in the early 1900s or something to that effect. And it's not just that, well, are they insured? They're literally not replaceable because whoever made them doesn't exist anymore. And obviously the sound in such an instrument gets better with age. So they're very particular over things like that. Other things are more common, you know, dressing rooms and observing break schedules and things like that are where we sort of share taking care of the artist, I suppose.
You mentioned who owns the instrument. Can you go a little bit into that? Because I know a number of musicians that don't own their instrument. So what does that mean for them?
Well, so it's a little bit different. If you mean they don't own it because they have it on loan from somebody, yeah. Right. Obviously, they actually might have an agreement with whoever provided them the instrument that they're the only ones who should be touching it and moving it and things like that. So that's one thing. There are some touring orchestras where there's like, I guess an umbrella insurance policy, or because they're a touring group, they're much more used to people moving their instruments. But even then, I still think it would be when they're in heavy duty cases. I'm talking about, you know, I have the orchestra set up, and for some reason we're running a sound cable through the wind section. I'm always a little bit on guard because I don't necessarily want a stage crew. And even though everybody is professional and doing the best they can, I don't want any accidents. So it's just being more on guard, regardless of, even if they didn't own the instrument themselves, who's in charge of that instrument, you know?
Yeah. What about cases? I know a lot of times when I do productions that have like orchestra on stage or orchestra in a site-specific place, that we really have to think about instrument cases, because for us, we would just be like, I'll go stick it in the dressing room and just walk your instrument with you to the stage. And it took me a while to realize why the instrumentalists were being such a, you know, everyone was like being so annoying about it. And you're, well, you know, so why is that so important for them?
It falls onto the category of that the instruments are irreplaceable, and almost a lot of them have a story of when they fell down the steps or where they tripped over something. So they want the shortest distance possible between taking that instrument out of the case and getting to the performance area. Really has to do with how far is the case, and are they going to fall, or is there going to be some sort of accident in between one place and the other?
Right. I know a lot of them won't go up and down stairs. When I did a show in San Diego, we had to provide an elevator for them because we wanted their cases downstairs, and they wouldn't walk upstairs. So we had to make sure there was an elevator so they could take the elevator upstairs to the stage level for them.
Precisely right.
Yeah. And a lot of the crew was getting angry, and I was like, look, I understand you're angry because this is kind of annoying, but you know, this instrument costs, you know, $200,000. So you can get angry all you want. I need to provide a place for them to go. Is that something that you usually think about when you go into a new venue, as where the instrument cases go, or is it just kind of show up and hope for the best?
It depends on the venue. It depends where we're at. A lot of the time I will ask for tables to be closer to, and we're also talking about, where am I? Are we on the main stage? Am I in a pit? What is, you know, that also affects, you know, what my next thing would say. So for example, if somebody's saying how they fell off, they know a story of they fell off a stage. Yeah, exactly. They're oddly clumsy. They're good at playing instruments. They're not good at like moving around. What was my, so I usually ask for tables, honestly, because that allows me, because the likelihood of us being who's the closest to the performance area, especially if we're talking about that one of you folks is on a gig with me, that means it's not a straight symphonic, and there's a theatrical, a dance element. There's something that you've been roped into this, and we're on this engagement together, which means it's probably somebody who's more featured on the stage than us, who's going to be closer dressing room wise. So that's when I go into where is the next best spot that's secure, and that's close.
We did fight over that for 3 years. Who got what dressing room? So as far as instruments being arranged in the pit, I always assumed before I got to work with orchestras that there was like a specific way, but is there kind of a basic way that 99% of orchestras are set up, and how do you know that?
I don't feel there is. And the big tidbit of this, my entire thing here, is I actually, like I said, I don't have a music background. I know how St. Luke's runs, and I know what how my musicians, what they tell me. So I don't want to, you know, give you a, this is the way it is. I can't, I can't say that for sure. But from what I've dealt with over the years is that there kind of isn't one basic way. There's usually this idea of a Broadway style pit or a symphonic setup. And I'm usually talking with the conductor, and it really depends on what is the music, who needs to be together. And then we sort of, and how much space do we have? And that sort of helps, you know, guide us to what exactly are we doing? Are all the strings on your left and all the winds are on the right? Which is not how I would set up a symphonic. But if that's what we need to do, if that makes sense for the pit. I will even tell you, so we were at the Koch Theater with Paul Taylor Dance for the last 4 or 5 years, I want to say. And I did not have the same setup. When we started, we did it one way, and then somewhere on year 2, we were like, no, this isn't the most best way. And we switched it, and we changed to a more traditional looking setup because we thought that was better for everyone in the pit. So it really kind of depends on who's holding the baton and what the music is and who your people are.
So you would mostly talk to what do you call it, maestro? Do you call it conductor?
It depends on them. So if I'm at Carnegie Hall, that person's a maestro. There are some people, if you're in the pit, you know, just out of respect, I start that way. And if they don't feel like that's who they are, they will tell me not to call them.
But you start with that because it's a place to start.
Unless this is like so terrible. Unless, you know, unless I really know where they are stature wise and do they know who they are. Like if they're like true pit conductors, those people are real cool. And there's no way they would take that label. So yeah. They understand that they're part of a bigger picture. If you're talking to like where the orchestra is the only thing on the stage, that conductor is your diva, you know, for lack of better terminology. Mm-hmm. So that person is definitely being adjusted as maestro.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Can you specify specifically what is the general difference between a Broadway style pit and a symphonic style pit in your mind?
In my mind, it's almost that concept of like, it's more chunky. So in a traditional setup, if I'm the maestro, and again, we're going to get into like minutia of string setups, but traditionally symphonic, the strings are in a semicircle around the conductor. The winds are upstage of the strings, and then brass upstage of that, or possibly split to either side, stage left, stage right, depending. That I can sometimes, depending on how many people and how big the pit is, sometimes I can do a version of that within the pit and at least keep the strings in that setup that my particular people are more used to, in that are being around the conductor with winds behind. When we do things like all of the winds are on the right and all of the strings are on the left, then we start looking, and that's a like kind of vague. But then it starts becoming more like a Broadway pit, in that the strings aren't like up front and center. Lighting is a good point to Heidi. We will get to that. Lighting is huge. So I'm not, because I don't work in a Broadway pit all the time, I don't want to say that that's the tried and true way, but generally if I don't have strings in the semicircle around the conductor, then I consider it like an alternative type pit, type setup.
We do have, before we go to Heidi's question, Angela was able to provide a few drawings of what her pit setups are. First, she uses this amazing program, which she gave to me 2 years ago, and I still haven't quite figured out, but the big question that a lot of people will have is setup in the pit, but also like size of instruments and how you do it. And not unfortunately, stage managers, really, it's not our position to do that, but oftentimes we are the people in the middle that like are the ones that are trying to get the information from maestro and trying to pass it on to the crew to set up the pit. And a lot of times maestro's giving you, you know, like little squares and X's, and you're trying to figure out what that means. So these are a few drawings that she has that she's done that kind of shows you the setup. And this is more of a traditional orchestra setup, right? Where you have your strings kind of around in the front, and then you have your horns and your brass
Mhm.
high.
The tidbit here is there's a difference between a traditional string setup and an antiphonal string setup, and this basically means where are the violins. So in this particular program, you'll see that the violin 1 is stage right of maestro, violin 2 is on the other side. They're opposing.
This here
Yeah,
and here.
yeah. Those sections are coming back. So that's one tidbit that does change, again, depending on the repertoire, depending on your conductor, just affects where people go. In regards to spacing, now in my particular group, and again, if your music parts indicated that everybody needed to be on their own stand, it would be a little bit different. But in this case, I sort of envision the violins, all of the strings, anybody who's sharing a stand, think of it kind of like a triangle. It has to they have to be spaced out enough, and it's usually about 2 feet from the music stand, but spaced out in such a way that they can reach the stand to turn the page, but not so close that they're on top of it. So you have to almost envision the way everybody is sitting, and that sort of helps with the spacing, because again, with any string player, if you imagine them holding their instrument and they're upright, they at arm's length, maybe with a lean to turn the page, and that's about it. So roughly 2 feet. When you get to cellos, and again, think of the instrument, that instrument is on the diagonal into the ground in front of them, so they need a little bit more space, because otherwise what will happen is their end pin will kind of need to be where the base of the music stand is. So they sit a little bit further back. When you get into winds and brass, they're the ones who can sit closer together, like, because their instrument is usually in front of them, except for flutes who are coming out to the side, and nobody wants to put their ear into the out of that. So that also creates some space. And horns where the sound is coming out from the side. So that's where, I would not put people side to side. Again, depending on where you're at, we'll do whatever is necessary. But if I were to come in and you had set it up, that's where I would be looking,
That's the first thing to look at.
Right.
Here's another one where you see they're a little bit more packed in, which is always a challenge. Your percussion is very beautiful on this one.
Sometimes I'm really on top of that, and sometimes I'm like, this is a bass drum, please observe. So, okay, so this is how you know this is actually Ted Sperling, so it's a Broadway type conductor. It's also not the Messiah, so it was a Broadway type show with a chorus behind me, which means I was cramped for space. Obviously, also percussion is taking up a huge section. So how do I accommodate that? So first you'll notice my strings are traditional, because generally opposing strings is going to be a certain period type of music. It's definitely not going to be Broadway. The next question that I would pose with the conductor or my music librarian is, are the keys integral to a rhythm section of types? Because I know this is Broadway type. Does that mean piano needs to be near bass? And I don't remember. It is quite possible they did want that and they couldn't get it because of how restricted we were. But for whatever reason, we decided, no, we didn't need to do that, which is why you see that big distance between the drum kit and the keys. Other thing is, obviously, I have all that chorus upstage of us, so I can't do my traditional brass upstage of the winds. I don't even have the room really to split them on a diagonal, so they almost end up absorbed into the rows. The horns ended up kind of behind upstage of the oboes and clarinets, which again, we're just sort of, this is like my, could I get what we ideally wanted? No. So now we go to plan, B or C and how to get everybody on there.
I think this is a good one to, for stage managers, because with Angela and I was working with the singers and the principals and the chorus, and she's in charge of the orchestra, and we'd show up and we would have these like little battles beforehand about, well, I need these 2 extra feet because we want somebody to come in here. And she was like, well, no, I have 4 bass players and they need this extra room, and so it's this little like maneuver back and forth about how we're going to make concessions. And in my opinion, the more I learned about orchestras and what they needed and why they needed it, and it's not just them being, like they need it for no reason, knowing why they needed it helped a lot to be like, okay, you're not just trying to be a diva, you physically cannot play your instrument, unless you have X, Y, and Z. So to me, it has been so helpful to learn all these things because it just makes my job easier. Aaron asked, what are the K's music stands? So yeah, can you answer the K's and also—
I'm sorry, I'm not a drafter. Yes.
No, it's perfect because at least you know what it is, but also the chairs that have X's on them.
Okay. One thing I'm gonna just say something about what you were just saying about how helpful it was to know what musicians need. And I will say it's such an amazing thing when I come into a space and somebody says to me, "Is there a way to get me space here? I'm trying to give this actor such and such," as opposed to some people who just come in and just start shoving chairs and stands up stage, and I'm like, "That's cool. We can't play like that," and then like nothing got accomplished. So there's just such an amazing thing when we just sort of both acknowledge that there's probably a reason we need the thing that was saying, but how do we both do it?
Yeah.
Yes, my K's are music stand indications. This is a very cheap program, and I did not take drafting. So this is my opinion of what the overhead looks like on a music stand. The X's on the chairs. We're sort of oddly known at Carnegie Hall because a lot of my string players sit on what is referred to as a cello chair, which if some places have more variety on chairs than others. Carnegie basically has your traditional Wanger and a cello chair. A cello chair is more upright in the back. Mm-hmm. So it's literally straight up, and it's a little bit higher. It's usually 18.5 inches off the ground, where a traditional chair is probably 17.5. I only know this because of our rehearsal space, and it comes up a lot. So we have this sad reputation for needing like every cello chair that Carnegie owns when we come there, and that's what the X's indicate, is where are my people who want cello chairs.
Do you have a different indication for your bass?
It's a circle because they're sitting on a stool.
Because they're stools, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it's helpful because even if you don't, like Erin said, she just assumed that that's what it was. So even if, you don't have a key, you just kind of know what all this is. And to be honest, most crews I've worked with, if you hand them this, they'll know exactly how to set up the pit, even without, even without a key, they have somewhere to start. And then you go in and, move them an inch this way and an inch that way because the crew will just set up. So I think it's an awesome program. There's another one. Where am I? This one I like. So they're so smashed in there that you had to spread everybody out this way, which is usually what I do to my orchestras. But yeah, it's just.
So prime example, this is, might be Master Voices, I believe. And Ted Sperling usually likes to elevate the pit so that the audience can see them, which means that all that space upstage of us is unusable because it is not on the movable part of the pit, which means everybody gets cramped on that downstage area. And this is a prime example of where can I put who? And there's a lot of discussion with the conductor about what does this mean? So that you end up with the horns next to the clarinets on the left, on your stage right, and brass on the other side with the percussion. So it's really just how do we make this work and who needs to be near who.
For those of you who work in devised theater or non-traditional spaces, I know this is Erin and I have talked about it, and Danielle, who's I'm pretty sure is on the call. We do a lot of things where like the orchestra's on stage or we're in this like weird experimental place. And this is where you should really become friends with your orchestra manager, because that's something that I find really helpful to tape out in our rehearsal room. So we know exactly how much space they have or where they're going to fit. And unfortunately, there's a number of times where the designers don't think about how much room an orchestra needs. And they design their entire set and they're like, okay, now we're going to fit a 62-piece orchestra in this like 10 by 10 area because my little X's fit. And I'm like, yeah, I don't think that's going to happen very well. So also why I think stage managers should be able to read floor plans and just have an idea of how much space they take up. Because if you're looking at that and you're in rehearsal and you're like, this isn't going to fit, the best time to fix that is in rehearsal before you actually get to the stage. It might be challenging at the time, but it's going to make your life so much easier to not show up to that first orchestra address and like have a whole bunch of angry instrumentalists there trying to figure out how to fit in the pit. And unfortunately, this is not something designers think about or even conductors really think about. It's not until they show up and they physically see them in front of them. So again, the more you know, the better. So then let's talk about lighting, especially in things like this where you're raised up, you now have more lighting issues. So what are the main things that instrumentalists are looking for?
The basics are being able to read the music stands. They don't actually care about their faces being lit. They only care about playing. And this is where we get into these moments with a lighting designer or, you know, somebody in front of house is like, well, we can't see their face. And then they shine the light on and then it blinds them and gives them spots in their eyes. And they really don't care sometimes about being seen. They only care about, you know, executing the performance sometimes. So from my point of view, there is always this idea of, I start with, is it possible for the light to be overhead and white? And then we get into, well, this is a whatever it is, and we can't do that. So now are you on stand lights? The next thing I will always tell you and everybody else is, are the stand lights at 100%? And are they not parked down? And this is why me having a stage management background or a theater background helps, because then when they tell me it's at 100%, I can be like, and what about the dimmers? So there's always, because that also backfires, because if I don't have, first of all, if I don't have the lights at 100%, then I start asking for 2. And so then when they were trying to decrease the amount of light we were emanating, I'm just doubling it. So we end up where we were anyway. The next thing is blackouts. Now, for us, I would never usually allow a blackout for them, because what we're concerned about is their eyes needing to dilate. So if you go black and then you come up and they're supposed to be on that first note, they can't see. So if usually it's a discussion, and it really depends on what we're trying to achieve. A lot of the times you'll see the blackout happens on stage, but you still see the glow of the stand lights. That's usually because their eyes need to stay with it. Did I touch everything on lighting? Do you feel like I missed something?
I think that's pretty good. The way I've gone around it in the past is we kind of like backlight them a bit, especially like this current setup in the pit, where they're all facing center. It's pretty easy to like backlight half and backlight half, so that and then they see their music even more, so we don't have like a lot of glowing music. But yeah, we spend, for Teatro Nuovo, we light our orchestra as much as we light the performers on stage, and we probably spend more time lighting the orchestra than we do anybody else, because we're worried. And we'll sit in like every chair and make sure that we're not blinded, because they're such a huge part of it. Somebody asked, which I never have to think about, how do you deal with spit? Sometimes it dries up at the end of the performance, and how does the orchestra run crew deal with the horn brass section?
It's just part of our lives. I don't know. We don't really do anything about it, to be honest. We just know that and they would also tell you it's condensation.
yes, they do.
It's not spit, it's condensation. Honestly, we don't do anything. We just know that that's what's happening in certain parts of the orchestra. I assume they just, you know, honestly, I don't even see stage crew do anything after shows. I just think we know it's there and it dries up and that's the end of it.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I don't think I've ever had to like wipe it up at the end of my things, or maybe they do it themselves, or maybe they don't condensate as much. I'm not sure, but it's so interesting. This person said, I once had a musician get up and walk off the stage complaining about lighting and in the middle of dress rehearsal. Yes. Yes.
A good thing to note is I don't believe most orchestras don't have a me. When folks hire St. Luke's, they're also hiring our production team, which is we come full package with a librarian and a personnel manager and ops. So I'm usually the person who's running this sort of interference or talking to the stage manager. But I'm sure there's plenty of gigs where there's nobody except for the contractor, the person who hired everybody. So I assume that most of you are often walking into situations where you're having something like that, where the musician is walking off because there's nobody running interference ahead of time. Not that that hasn't happened to me either, but I would usually shove them back and then I would be the one who would convey these complaints. But so there's just something else to keep in mind, that like the more you folks are aware of these things, it probably will help, because I don't always think you're getting a production team with any group of musicians that you're working with.
No, oftentimes it's like a librarian and maybe one other
A
person.
contract, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's not what they do. Does sound control get maintained throughout the day, and who's in charge of that? In the UK, health and safety standards dictate the most amount of decibel workers, musicians and crew alike can expose to throughout the day. It determines the sections like brass and potential position in relationship to each other. Do you have to deal with anything that here?
I don't, only because, yes, point taken with the decibel levels, and that does come up from time to time, and somebody will complain to me about being too close to somebody else. So it's on their minds, and it's always like a worry in the back of our heads. But at the same time, I don't really know how you play in an orchestra and not be next to other people. Though I guess we're all going to find that out in the next couple of months, I suppose.
Right. We're going to have operas with masks on.
With masks and baffles between everybody, right?
Well, how do you decide baffles? Do you guys use plexiglass baffles or any other kinds in between the brass sections?
Nobody wants them. So before we get to that, let's talk about sound a little bit more. Is that my goal anywhere with my folks is always to be acoustic. They're a classical group. So in our particular case, we, not that we poo-poo amplification, but there's always this general sense of we want to sound the way we would naturally sound. But for obviously with things with singers or things where you're in the pit, amplification is just part of that theatrical thing. In that case, there's usually somebody from my artistic team who is in the house attempting to have an opinion on the mix, but that really depends on how we got brought into the gig. And whether or not the person paying for the gig cares about those types of things. So whether or not we can get our voices heard on that is really kind of depending. We would never be the type who would be advocating for overly loud types of things just because it's not the way we would want our sound to be anyway. And in terms of baffles are usually not desired, and they usually come out for me when we're too close together. If a string player is right in front of, so look at what we're looking at it right now. If you look 2 stands back, stage left of the conductor position, you see those viola stands, there you go, and then you see my notes baffle, because they're literally, the horn of the trumpet is in their head. And so in that case, I'm using it as protection, and that's generally where I use them. Again, with Broadway type stuff, if you had a very large kit on stage and everything was being mic'd, then they'd probably want the entire kit baffled so they could isolate it on the mics or things like that. I use them primarily to protect ears. It's not usually put into place for acoustics from the audience perspective, but totally, yes, it does come up in Broadway type gigs. It comes up when things are being amplified and they need to do more isolation.
You guys also provide earplugs at every rehearsal, right? You just have a whole thing of them so people can use them. I
usually wing it and try to decide if the engagement needs them. But yes, yeah, my folks are kind of spoiled, I will say. But yes, I will go around with earplugs for sure, which is always funny when you're like in front of the soloist and you're like, I'm sorry, you sound great, but this person thinks you're too loud. So yes, earplugs all the way.
Cheryl brought up, when I do opera, I found it very fruitful to be in a good relationship with the first violin. What is the importance of the first violin? And usually people just say the first. And the first time someone said that to me, and I was like, great, I have no idea what that means. Who am I talking to? What does that mean? And what is the significance of that person? Why are they so important?
So that was what we would also call the concertmaster. And that person is sitting stage right of your conductor on the downstage chair. If you see where it says, yeah, that's exactly the spot. Now, on some cases, if you're in a pit setup and they don't want to be by the wall, they may switch with that person upstage. For the most part, they are in that featured position. And they are sort of leading in a sense. They are the ones who are communicating to the rest of the strings. They have this more prominent point. Like there's always a very specific choice on, if you don't have a permanent concertmaster, like for us, we're choosing per engagement. that's always a discussion, because that person is in this prominent position. They are the one with the most contact with the conductor. They are also the one conveying the most information back to the sections.
And they're the ones that tune usually, correct?
Depending on your engagement as well, they would possibly also have an entrance, and and they would be the ones to take the A from the oboe. So let's talk about this for a minute, because sometimes this comes up. If the way an orchestra tunes is the oboe player actually gives the A. The concertmaster takes the A, plays it, and then everybody joins. There are some particular cases where if there is a keyboard on stage, that now the oboe player has to get the A from the piano before they made the entrance, because that has to match. So there's just some things to keep in mind. That tuning could potentially be a big discussion of, like, how are we getting the A? When is it happening? What happens if there's no oboe player? What happens if it's just strings? Then it's the concertmaster taking the A, probably from their tuner or from a colleague that they think they might like collaborate with the cello or the bass, and try to just make sure that they're in the right ballpark before they give this A. And forgive me for the dog whining in the background.
I was wondering what that is, but
He's very sad.
This was different when I worked with Orchestra St. Luke's. How does the top of show look for you? What are the procedures? Because at least for me, working in opera, the hardest part for me in any show is top of show, because it's something you never really get to rehearse. So for you guys, what does that look like as far as, like, lights go down, someone gave an announcement, first the principal goes out first, like, what is that setup like?
Okay, so the first question is always going to be, does the orchestra need to make an entrance? From my perspective, most musicians don't want to do this, because they want to be on stage, getting themselves settled, making sure they're situated, starting to prepare a little bit. So they don't necessarily want that. But that's the first question, is do we need to make an entrance, or can we be in our performance position? The next question is always, is the concertmaster making an entrance? And the next is the conductor making an entrance? For something like some shows we've had, everybody's just got to be there because there's another theatrical element that's going on, and it's not about us. So there's no entrances. Without the entrances, then becomes, how does the concertmaster know when to tune? So the entrances serve kind of an element of preparing for the audience that we're going to start, and that usually gives us silence so that we can hear each other when we tune. If you don't have that aspect, then you're relying on the concertmaster knowing something that indicates to them to tune. And in terms of, like, cue lights, or the house is going to go down, it really kind of depends. Like, can they see it? Do they know it's happened? A lot of the time, I'm on headset with the stage manager, and when they call the warning to stop a show, I go out and poke the concertmaster and be like, stare at that cue light. Because they're just sort of like doing whatever, and they're not, they need that sort of prep time. So that was like not an answer, but basically it's more like a logic proof.
And then afterwards, or I guess somebody cues Maestro to go on, but afterwards, how do you guys do bows? In opera, we have Maestro come up onto the stage, and then he bows, and then he motions to the orchestra. What do you do with just a
same if we're in the pit? Yeah, if we're in the pit, or we're in some ballet is the same as well. The conductor, we have again with Paul Taylor, if the soloist would sometimes go up as well with the conductor, they motion to the orchestra, lights up, orchestra up, face the audience, bow, lights up, they sit. So pretty I think similar across whatever art we're participating with.
Another question was, can you talk about bumpers and standard doubling? How do they affect the layout?
I don't actually know the word bumper.
I don't either. Oh, what are bumpers? But I know doubling, a lot of...
Doubling Doubling really, I don't feel is going to affect you so much. It's more of when we're hiring, we need to make sure the oboe needs to bring an oboe d'amore and the flute needs to bring an alto flute. So where it would really come up is what we personally call the saxophone doublers or the reed books. There's a reed book and they're playing 4 or 5 instruments. If the saxophone player is playing every alto, soprano, then their footprint is getting bigger and bigger because literally they're sitting amongst 6 instruments. This is very big in Broadway. So anybody who's done that, you're familiar with that. So for example, if in this particular plot that we're looking at right now, if my wind players were actually reed doublers, that would not work at all because they would have no way to fit as many instruments as they needed and before an upstage, downstage. It just wouldn't work. In this case, it works because they're just playing the one instrument. Maybe they have another one like right in front of them. But if it gets into like a lot of doubling, tripling, reed books, then you have to consider footprint.
Mm-hmm. What was it for a call? I'm looking through my notes of what other questions we had for you.
That's fine.
You got most of the ones we talked about, I think.
Somebody asked about conductor light, I think. Conductor special, I think. I'm just going to talk about it because I think it came up. Yes, and I would always say, well, there's 2 points, right? Like, so from a theatrical perspective, you always have that like moment that the conductor got to the podium and then the lights on him and it's, you know, very dramatic. But from our point of view, we want to know if we can see the hands. And that's, it's not even the face. Same thing also, it's usually better if the conductor does not have a stand light because what that'll do is the light is usually shining into the house. So depending on where the conductor is, if his lights are on his stand and the audience can see it, usually you'll get a complaint about that. So it's almost better if the conductor special is coming from somewhere above so that the person doesn't need a stand light, they're able to see their music, and we're able to see the hands. And I'm going to throw something out there, but a person of color, this becomes even more important. And this has happened to us where there was very little light and this was just not going to fly. So we have to be kind of aware of what we're in, you know.
Just like the background, when I do something not in the pit, do they have a solid background behind them so that it's easy to see the conductor and they're not, we needed it for opera because we had the camera on them and then the singers couldn't see Maestro's hands because of the audience behind, and so they were just seeing movement out of the corner of their eyes. So it was, we had to set up like a little background behind him so that he was blind. Yeah. You could see it. Oh, the other question we had was, and again, big in what I've dealt with, but I've had artistic directors and maestros when they're talking about orchestra just say, oh, you know, it's 4, 4, 2, 2, 1, 7, and horns. And I'm like, yeah, this makes absolutely no sense to me. What do those numbers mean? And why can't you just say specific numbers and everybody knows what you're talking about?
There's actually like a formula of how these numbers go. Can you scroll through my plots? Do I have that written out on any of them? There you go. See at the bottom, you see Tchaikovsky Symphony No. 1. So this is the standard instrumentation written out in numbers. And basically it works that the first section, the first 4 is winds. My next section is brass, and I'll go back and spell this out more. My next section is timp, percussion, keys, harp. My last section is strings. So if I go back to the beginning, when you see that 3, 2, 2, 2, that means there are 3 flutes, and you can see that reflected on the plot. 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 bassoons. If I had doubling, and if I'm feeling very thorough, you might see letters after these numbers. If the 3 had a P after it, that would be telling me that somebody was on piccolo. So there's a doubling indication. There's a book called The Daniels that basically lists the instrumentation for a lot of repertoire. And this is essentially the formula on how these things are relayed. And in the beginning of The Daniels, it gets really into like how the doubling is listed and that kind of thing. From my point, for sharing this kind of information, I'm really just trying to convey how many people are going to be out there. So I don't tend to reflect the doubling on the plots for the most part because it's really just for me anyway. So looking at that second section, you're looking at 4, 2, 3, 1. Again, that is 4 horns, and we'll notice right now that I have 5 drawn, two trumpets, 3 trombones, and 1 tuba. So that's there. Then your next section is timp, then percussion. Then the keys are broken out into 2 separate numbers, and we always kind of mix them up on which one's piano and which one's synthesizer or other key. Actually, I missed one. The middle number is harp. So 1, 2, 0. That middle 0 means there's not a harp. And then your last one is your strings, and that is violin 1, violin 2, viola, cello, bass. So the 12 is your violin 1s. And then by the time you get to the end, your 4 is bass. And this is sort of the standard in conveying this kind of information. There is sometimes some argument with people on, do I mean 12 people or do I mean 12 music stands, meaning that it would be 24 people. And usually I believe it is written with the dynamic of number of stands. Sorry, number of people, pardon. But
I was like, oh, I've always said it the other way.
No, number of people. 12 is people. So it's just something to keep in mind. If something seems like you're not agreeing on something, it's possible that that definition is not clear. So.
Then you usually in your layouts, you list specifically where here, like it says horn and clarinet and oboe, but you don't necessarily do that with strings. Is that because the strings are a little bit more common, like you said? You did list.
Well, they're in a clump, right? So violin 1 is going straight back violin 1, right? And then if you take the next section, violin 2 is going straight back. Now, because in this particular case, there's so many of them, I'm actually going to count this for you. 4, 6, 8, 10. Right. Okay. So in between those two, like if you look at violin 1 as a line and violin 2 as a line, there's that one desk in between. That's because there's so many violin 1s that I have to tuck somebody around because I'm hitting the wall or it's not looking symmetrical when I'm looking at the stage in its entirety. So for the most part, I don't label all of the strings because they're essentially in a block.
You just kind of know where they're going to go.
Well, right, because I know the violin 1s are all going to be violin 1s, you know. And if it's something weird, then I'm definitely going to label it. I'm also going to label it if I know there's amplification, because a lot of the time something is happening with sound before I've gotten there, or they're deciding something. So I try to be a little bit more thorough with amplification situations, because I know that becomes a thing. That's usually why I'll try to lay music ahead of time, because when they're miking, I know that comes up, and so they don't have to rely on me being like, that's a horn, you know. So that's usually something that helps. I've occasionally used Post-its and labeled all the stands that way.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Oh, this is a good one about communication, because again, it's something that I've always struggled with. Prior to an engagement, do you communicate with musicians directly, or do you send notes to somebody else who then communicates to the artists?
So that's actually a good question. And again, that's just specific to St. Luke's. Is I do have a personnel manager. So it really depends on what we're talking about. Most of the time, all of our communication is being filtered through the personnel manager because he's the primary contact for them. If for whatever reason, there's a theatrical component, or there's something like really where we need to, like, you know, bring in the bigwig here, then perhaps I may be like, you know, further to this reminder, you're going to be asked to be outside and please bring your least favorite instrument, you know, something, if, you know, but I'm usually not the direct contact, but that's only because we do have a department for this. Whereas in another situation, you probably just have your contractor, and the contractor is going to be the one distributing information for the most part.
I believe you guys have this at St. Luke's. You have the personnel manager, and you have the librarian.
Correct.
Right? So can you just give a couple sentence descriptions of what each one of them does and why they're all essential? But I also have a hard time. I would always go to like Jules when I didn't need to, and then I just started CCing all of you guys because I wasn't sure who was doing what.
Fine. Yeah, so for us, and there's even one more, which is Valerie, who is my boss and essentially general manager and head of the whole situation in a way. So, so my staff, the personnel manager is the primary contact with musicians. He's the one making the calls for hire. especially with us because we're per service. They're not a full-time group. Not everybody is called for everything. So we're hiring for each engagement. Not that other orchestras don't have personnel managers regardless, because someone has to relay the schedule and what you're doing and where you're going. So for the most part, personnel is main contact with musicians. He's also the one for entering the pay information into our database, which then goes to finance to go to paychecks. So we're like the first layer of getting them paid. He's also responsible for submitting all the paperwork to the union so that benefits are paid and things like that. So personnel, essentially the people. Librarian is getting the music, so renting it, acquiring it, pulling it from our stacks, distributing it to the musicians, and then getting, not only getting information from them that has to be conveyed. So for example, string principals, so being essentially your first chair in each of the sections, may have bowings, which is essentially which way is the bow is going, and may want to convey that information to the rest of the section. They send that information to library. Library marks the part, sends it out. Library is also responsible for implementing cuts or whatever, any sort of notes or information from the conductor that needs to go. Libraries is putting that all into their parts. They're also cleaning up the parts to return them to publishers at the end. Yeah, and that's pretty much the summary. What I essentially do is sort of the production manager job that has been carried throughout the years. So I'm doing the logistics of, you know, how are we going to be on the stage? What is it that we need? You know, where the rental's coming from and that kind of stuff.
As far as parts, singers always take parts home with them, take their music with them when they come and go, but the orchestra leaves it, for the most part, at the venue. Is that true?
It depends. It depends. A lot of them have practice parts sent to them, or they have it electronically, so they don't need the hard copy. We kind of have to like threaten them. So they're usually pretty good about telling library, I'm going to take this. Is this okay? Just because we don't want to lose anything in between day one and day two. And a lot of the time they have another copy of it somewhere. So if they're just going home to practice, they probably don't need their bowing notes or little, crescendo markings from rehearsal. So they can leave the original with us.
I had an issue this summer where we didn't have an orchestra librarian, which is why I'm asking all these librarian questions, because I was the only one in the room as the production manager. And so they just started giving me their books with their notes. And I was like, what am I supposed to do with this? And I had to like transfer it because we there was a page turn thing, And so my first violin, who was super nice, she like explained to me how to do it. She's like, I'll learn. And so I learned how to do it. And then I had to transfer it to all of the other, which is not a stage manager thing. It's very special in this situation. But
we had a season where we were in between librarians, and I'm pretty sure it was a Crutchfield opera, and we had to put in cuts. And it was me, who has no music background, can't read music, and I run an orchestra, so chuckle at that as much as you like. And my colleagues, who happened to also not be musicians at the time, putting in notes. And so we were like, anything that I possibly saw got copied into 12 parts. You could have scribbled a house in the corner. It went into 12 parts because I didn't know if it was important or not. So I feel you.
Yeah, it's a very special thing to do. Another question that came up is starting 5 minutes after publish time. Is there a rule for that, or is that just kind of standard practice that people do, or how is that determined on your guys' end?
So there's always a concern of one about overtime, right?
Always,
there is a contractual rule about not starting past 5 minutes unless it is mutually agreed upon, and this is something that we put in the language to anybody who is hiring us. Obviously, most of us are starting at 7 or 8 minutes past, which usually it's not a big deal. We say it just in case we end up on a gig where somebody's like, oh, we're going to wait a half an hour. That's potentially problematic. It's problematic because, one, we don't want to hit OT on the end time because that clock has started. The clock started at 8 o'clock, whether or not you started at 8 or 8:05. So we have to just be aware of those things because musicians are called from the call time. You can't change it last minute. So it's usually in a CBA, it's usually in a union agreement, and it's potentially also in the agreement between the individual musicians and the presenter.
I do have to say, for stage managers, this is a huge thing to pay attention to, because in opera, you don't always have that person like Angela there with you. And you don't, 90% of the time, you're not going to get their CBA. And so you need to find out what the orchestra breaks are, how they're going to work in your rehearsal, when you're going to start, and how close you are to overtime. Because in opera especially, but I'm sure other venues or other cases are like this, once you have an orchestra there, it's orchestra time, and it's not tech time, and it's not doing notes, and it's not let's run the scene change again, you know, like orchestra time is orchestra time. And if you know what those break situations are in advance, you can then create your train schedule, and you can work with your director and your designers and everybody in advance to know, you know, we're going to have to take a break before we hit intermission. Where's the best place to break, and how does it fall within the orchestra's time frame? Because you can't take it too early. You have to have X number of minutes usually before you take the break, so it's in a more specific time frame. And sometimes, if you know, I forget which opera it was I did, but we knew that Act 1 was longer than the 90 minutes, you know, we had to go back to the orchestra and kind of negotiate with them and be like, this is going to run 92 minutes, you know, how does that work? Do we need to take a break earlier? You know, how is that going to work with our runtime? But the more you know about that and how to communicate with them, then it, again, it's just going to make your tech rehearsal and performances go so much easier, because you're not all of a sudden going to get to a point where I've had orchestra members like get up and walk out 2 minutes before the end because they, you know, we didn't time manage correctly, and, you know, we took a little bit too long in a scene change, and, you know, they got angry. So the more that you know that, the easier it is to run tech rehearsals.
Yeah, and I will say that the 802 union, the musicians union CBA, the break schedule is not the same as Actors Equity, is not the same as AGMA, is not the same as somebody else. So I thank you. Yeah, there's definitely not. So there definitely needs to be coordination on when our breaks are.
And usually you follow the orchestra break, because that's the one.
I think we're the most strict, actually.
Yeah. And a lot of times I've worked with companies where orchestra ends at a certain time, but singers call us for another like half hour after that. And that's usually when we do the notes or practice bows or whatever, you know, and so.
Yeah, a lot of the time I will say, do what you need to do with the musicians now, because you're on the clock. And then and if it's talking to people, or if you don't need to wait, if you don't need to use that time, don't, because, you know, we're cutting down those minutes. We don't have that. There's, you know, musicians don't have 10 out of 12. They don't have that theory of we're going to sit around and wait for something to happen. There's kind of none of that, mostly from a price point, but also it's not their culture. It's not what you're doing. And then you're paying for them to sit around. And in that case, you don't want to worry about that necessarily.
Yeah. What about overtime and grace periods? Do you guys have any of those kind of built in?
There are no grace periods. I'm literally counting the seconds. I'm often hovering over either one of you or the conductor or somebody, where I'm about to like literally stop you while you're in your biggest moment, because I'm like, yeah, we're out of time. So there are no grace periods for sure. In regards to overtime, again, it depends on the individual agreement. For us, if it's more than one work in a concert, overtime hits at 2.5 hours. If there is one work and you're doing an opera, for example, then overtime would hit at 3 hours. So you have to kind of know what you're working with and know what union agreement you're on. In terms of, I can also hit overtime in a rehearsal, and that will happen if you don't observe the breaks. If they're supposed to get 25 minutes of break on a 2.5 hour call and we don't observe that, that incurred an overtime segment. If we, at the last minute, extend the rehearsal, that incurred an overtime segment. There's no changing the call times once we're basically in the day for the most part. If it's the day before, it's considered a change usually. But then you can't punish anybody, or, you know, there can't be any actions if they can't make the change. Yeah.
Yeah. I have done shows where we knew a show was, or we knew an act was longer than that. And so we've gotten permission, I guess it's kind of like a grace, to run a longer than 90-minute Act 1. But again, that was, we knew in advance what it was and how to do it. And I've also done shows where we had literally a 30-minute intermission, because our musicians were so tired. their arms were so sore. It was a Rossini piece, you know, and they like were crazy for 90 minutes, and we had to take a half-hour break because they couldn't move their arms at the end of Act One.
Wow. Wow.
That was last year's Teatro Nuovo. Yeah, it was just crazy. They're all just like laying there. It was an intense piece. And so, you know, sometimes, and until then, I didn't even think about the orchestra needing a break. You know, I was like, oh no, we're fine. We could get this scene change done and the singers are fine. And, you know, my first violins are like, no, we can't move. We have to have a longer break than that. Something that I keep messing up, which is a big thing for people to keep in mind, and this was pointed out to me 2 years ago. I traditionally said like performers and orchestra, or I use the term musicians for orchestra, and I got called out on that because singers are also musicians. Mm-hmm. So it's been hard for me, but I'm trying to train myself to use instrumentalists and singers, or use musicians as a whole, or performers as a whole, because you can't even say like performers and musicians, you know, because they're all the same thing. So I catch myself doing it all the time, and I catch a lot of other theater backstage people doing it all the time. So I just wanted to point that out. That
Yep, I've gotten in trouble with that as well.
Yeah, all the time. And once it was pointed out to me, and I was like, no, you're right. Yep, I never thought about that. Can we write smaller? Someone said communication is key, which I agree with.
Hello.
I know we're running, well, we're close to time, but one more person said, how do you deal with piano if it's not part of the pit, so that you can segue from orchestra rehearsal to a piano rehearsal? I don't know if you've ever had to deal with that. I have a number of times. And what I have done is put, especially if the orchestra is in the pit, we put the piano, when it's room, outside of the pit, like in the audience section. So then it's easy. He could still see maestro. The pianist is high enough that they can be heard usually on the stage. And then when you do that transition, you have the piano there already. A lot of times if they're in the pit, they can't hear as well. And you don't want to have time to move things around, because then that takes up minutes. But that's how I've transitioned if I need to. But sometimes it's just, well, this is when we're going to give notes, or this is when we're going to practice a scene change, or this is when we do bows, because this is all the time, you know, that we have with orchestra. I've loved all you guys' questions. This is great. I think of questions, but, you know.
I have two things, whenever you're ready, as things that often blindside me.
Yes, go for it.
For you to know. So there's two things that often come up, and one is, what is the orchestra wearing at the dress rehearsal? And this is a contractual thing for us, that if, and again, consult your local union agreement, we can't force them to wear concert clothes at a dress rehearsal unless you're paying them the concert wage. Now, on an opera contract, they are getting paid the dress pays as a concert, so we can make them do that. But if they're being paid in some other way, excuse me 1 second.
Dogs and fiancés, I think.
Yeah, don't have a Zoom call with many animals. So it depends on how we're paying the musicians, depends on whether or not we can tell them to wear certain things. Now, the way we get around it is, if you could possibly do dark clothes so that lighting could get a feel for things, that would be great, but we can't force them. So that is just something to keep in mind, that if somebody thinks you're in a tech meeting, I'm not often in those, and you hear somebody thinking that they're going to get lighting, you know, at the dress, you might want to check in with the orchestra. The other thing that comes up is recording rehearsals, recording concerts. This is not okay with us usually, and usually if it's an archive recording you want to do of a concert, our particular languages we have to vote. If it's anything more than that, we usually would not allow it because it will incur cost. Archiving the dress, it's a little bit fuzzy. Now that you say that, I don't think we're actually allowed to do it, but I think we often talk to our committees to see if it's, you know, is that instead of the concert or in addition, or what exactly is the motive on that? We personally would still have to vote depending on your agreement. Any other recording most likely incurs cost. So we're very cautious about that. Even if we're in a rehearsal room and so-and-so just wants to record the orchestra, we've literally had moments, and don't nobody call 802 on me, where we just turn a blind eye because we know that so-and-so is literally doing it so they can practice at home. And I may go up to them and be like, hey, that can't go anywhere. If that goes anywhere, then somebody's going to get billed 200% of the concert wage. So it's just something to keep in mind, that if anybody ever says we're going to record it, the musicians need to be consulted.
But that's a good point about, because so many people, everybody has cell phones with recording devices on it now. And there have been a number of times where, you know, someone's standing backstage or someone's standing in rehearsal and you know they're recording it, you know, and you have to either stop them or you have to say, please stop being so obvious about this because you're going to get everybody in trouble. Right. You know, if you need to record it because you need to practice, that's one thing, but you're technically not allowed to. So don't do it.
Yeah.
Your thing about dress, what to wear, does your agreement stipulate what concert attire is? Or if they're asked to wear something specific, does that count as a costume?
So we don't stipulate the concert attire is always this, and per the gig we will indicate, is it dark suit, is it pit black, is it nice blacks, is it tux? Yeah, so we will indicate per service. We don't have a standard. If you go down the role of, well, you know, we're going to give you these shirts, we usually can get away with that. We have to be aware of laundering, and obviously we're doing for them what you would do with other people who are working in, you know, in costumes, and making sure that they're taken care of in that way. I'm trying to think. I don't think we've ever paid musicians for wearing costumes, as long as it's provided and laundered and they're literally showing up, getting the stuff, and then giving it back, and they're doing no work on their part. Usually we have not had to pay them in any way, but it is something to think about if it's coming up on your service.
We had it for one just because we had 4 cellists on stage playing, and the director wanted them to wear blacks, but they needed to be like pants, they couldn't be skirts, it had to be like non-flashy, you know, like he had all these regulations, and the orchestra came back and said, you're now pretty much giving them a costume, you have to pay them extra because you're saying this is what you have to wear. Mm-hmm. And the director doesn't think about that. He's just like looking at visually what's on the stage and not thinking about the fact that, you know, the orchestra might get mad. So again, that's something stage managers can look at and be like, and go to the production manager and be like, hey, this came up in rehearsal, is this going to cause a problem later on?
It's really almost practicality. Like, maybe they don't have I know it's ridiculous, but maybe they don't have performance pants. Maybe they always wear a skirt, and
yeah, exactly.
And because they're not actors, you run into a little bit of that thing with, are you requiring them to adhere to gender norms? And that's always a thing where, because it's not the same as we've presented you with a costume. Now you're telling them to wear pants. So there's a bit of a fuzzy area there that we have to just keep in mind too.
Yeah, yeah. But directors and designers aren't going to think about that. They're just going to see the visual picture they want to see. And then, you know, as a stage manager, it's always good to like throw that in the rehearsal report, or not even in the rehearsal report. Sometimes that's a separate email, but you know, the more you know, the better. Well, we've hit a little over an hour. I'm not being a very good stage manager and going into overtime, but there's so many good questions that I was very excited to get through all of these. So thank you so much, Angela. This was great. It was amazing. And I'm so glad that so many people got to ask questions and get answers and learn a little bit about orchestra and why it's important for us to know a little bit about it, even if we're not necessarily working with them 24/7. You know, we, especially in opera, you know, they like show up and go right into the pit and you don't even see their faces. But if you know what's going on, it just makes our lives so much easier. So thanks.
For sure.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for listening.
Yeah. Thank you all. Thanks, Angela. Oh, and for those who want, this is recorded, and at some point it will get up on our website. So if you want to go back and refer to anything, or if, you know, you have friends who want to check it out, then it will be on our website for members only. So we can refer back to all the awesome information so that I can remember what all the little numbers at the bottom mean, which is always my difficult part. Thanks, Angela. Bye.
You're welcome. Thanks, everyone.